The emperor only selected his headquarters at the last moment. Two considerations had led him to form this habit. First, a measure of wise prudence, and second, he admitted that this himself, the advantage of having the whole of his entourage at his call until the very end of the day, thus keeping everyone on alert. He used sometimes to say to me, "If you make everything difficult, the really hard things seem less so." Officers and men sometimes suffered from these practices, no doubt, but that did not trouble the emperor, who looked only to the main result, and being in the midst of his army and of a considerable guard, gave little thought to the organization of detail. Ever intent on taking the offensive, he failed to notice the trouble the Cossacks gave, now that the odds were against us. The guard had been in advance throughout that day, and so were obliged to fall back later on in order to take up position. Not having bivouacked until dark, they did not themselves know where they were, or what was the lie of the land, but must have thought themselves still in the midst of the army. They put out no patrols. They felt secure in the belief that the rest of the troops were covering headquarters from a distance, and did not trouble even to make contact with them. In fact, the guard and the headquarters took no account of anything that went on outside their own area. One battalion of the guard was bivouacked barely 300 yards from the spot, on the same side of the road where the Cossacks had spent the night, and whence they came upon the emperor. By night or by day, the emperor would mount his horse without warning. He even took pleasure in going out all of a sudden and throwing everyone off the scent. His saddle horses were divided into troops. Each troop consisted of 2 horses for himself, 1 for the master of horse, and as many were necessary for the other officers on duty with the emperor. Throughout the whole 24 hours, there was always 1 troop of horses saddled and bridled. Every officer had also to have a horse bridled, and the picket on duty, which consisted of an officer and 20 light horse, was always saddled and bridled. The squadrons in attendance provided and relieved the picket. On the other campaigns, there was 1 squadron in attendance, but on the Russian there were 4, half light cavalry and half grenadiers and dragoons. The picket never left the emperor. The squadrons followed in echelon formation and saddled only when the emperor called for his horse. As he did so in haste and without warning, he always set out with only 2 or 3 other persons. The remainder caught up. After Moscow, and indeed after Smolensk, the same squadrons remained in attendance for 2 or 3 days running. Men and horses both were worn out. The emperor usually returned to his quarters very late after nightfall. The squadrons in attendance bivouacked as best they could, hurriedly and in the dark. When the emperor mounted his horse in the field, he usually set up out at a gallop, if only for 200 or 300 yards. However keen and alert they were, therefore, it was difficult for a troop to be actually alongside him from the start. This explains how the emperor came to be almost alone at one moment on the day of this scuffle. The Prince of Neuchatel and I were always close behind the emperor's horse. The general in command of the guard, who was then on duty, rode at our side, but during the Russian campaign, the generals of the guard all had other commands, and the master of horse then fulfilled their duties by right. When mounted, we rode in the following order: an advance guard of 4 light horse, 3 orderly officers, 2 or 4 aides-de-camp, this group 80 paces forward, the emperor, behind him the master of the horse, the guard's officer of the day, the chief of staff, behind these several aides, if the emperor so commanded, and 6 staff officers from the emperor's staff, 2 other aides-de-camp, and 2 officers attached to the chief of staff, then the officer and chasseurs constituting the picket, and then 500 paces behind, the squadrons in attendance. If we were riding daily, they followed. If the emperor galloped, they trotted. These details show how small was the emperor's escort and how far he was from surrounding himself with a whole host of men, as some have asserted. The emperor wavered for some time. October 25th, the fight at Malo-Yaroslavets was, in his opinion, not enough to counterbalance the defeat of the King of Naples. Moreover, at the moment, he wished to put himself in the right about that morning's escapade. It was only after long insistence on our part and after he had weighed the probability that Kutuzov, if he would not stand and fight in an excellent position such as Malo-Jaroslavets, was not at all likely to join battle 20 leagues further on, that we were able to persuade the emperor, in this unofficial sort of council, to take the road to Borovsk. Their part of the troops, the greater part of the artillery, and all the carriages were already stationed. In view of the state of the horses, this last was a weighty consideration. Did the emperor wish to seem that he was yielding only to the convictions of others, or did he really believe that he might yet break the Russian army and at last turn the whole campaign to his advantage before he decided on his winter quarters? I cannot say, but it is certain that the same question had been urgently presented to him during the night by some of those same people, and that he had resisted every conceivable argument brought forward to persuade him. He merely postponed his decision until he could see for himself whether the enemy had really escaped him. It was for this reason that he had wished to set out before dawn. He came back to Gorodnia, and from there set out his orders. The next day, the army marched towards Borovsk, where the staff slept on the night of the 26th. A few inhabitants had returned to the town. It might be thought that when he left Moscow, the emperor had somehow anticipated the course of events, for he had ordered various precautionary measures against the Cossacks. But, as we have seen, they were unavailing. Nobody was used to keeping good guard, and all were too much disheartened and too exhausted to change their ways. Every man's first thought on arrival was to find food for himself and his horses, and this could only be done by going off the main road, and so risking capture by the Cossacks or murder by peasants. The marches were too hard, and the cavalry too few and exhausted for adequate detachments to be sent out on reconnaissance or to cover our flanks. We made light, as far as was possible, of the risks run by the emperor in the scuffle with the Cossacks. But within 48 hours, the whole army knew the story, and the impression made was regrettable. This incident should have served as a warning to everyone, proving as it did our want of vigilance. But the lesson passed unnoticed. At the same time, it reflected no credit on the daring or courage of the Cossacks, who allowed themselves to be driven off and yielded their gains to 200 or 300 horsemen. They are certainly the finest light troops in the world for guarding an army, scouting the countryside, or carrying out skirmish sallies. But whenever we faced up to them and marched against them boldly in a solid body, they never offered resistance, even when they outnumbered us 2-1. Attempt to attack them singly or charge them in scattered formation, and one was lost. They returned to pursue as quickly as they withdraw from the attack. Being better horsemen and mounted on more responsive horses than ours, they can escape us when necessary or pursue us when it suits them. They spare their horses. They may sometimes race them or set them to long and exacting rides, but they generally spare them the futile running to and fro by which we wear out our own. On the 27th, the emperor passed the night at Vereya to give the artillery and other horse-drawn equipment time to take the lead. Having started very early, he reached the town during the morning, passed straight through, and did not halt until he was half a league beyond, on the road to Moyeysk. At the top of a rise overlooking the country road, there he stayed to watch the troops and convoys pass, and there they brought him Lieutenant General the Count of Vinsingroda, aide-de-camp to the Tsar. He had commanded a body of light troops stationed on the road to Tver in order to cover Petersburg and keep watch on Moscow, where he was taken prisoner. As divergent accounts of this affair have been told since the war, I shall give here the particulars I noted down from the reports made to the emperor at the time it took place. Having probably learnt that the French army had gone, Monsieur Vinsingroda, who was near Moscow, went into the suburbs and entered into talk with some of the inhabitants. Several light attacks by the Cossacks or by armed peasants had forced the Duke of Treviso to draw in his small horses so as to not expose them to the danger in that large city. Our troops, being concentrated around the Kremlin, Monsieur Vincigroda came disguised into the town as far as our outposts, and he entertained the hope of carrying out some military operations which should force the Duke of Treviso to evacuate.